Let's review a couple of concepts that we've talked about just to make sure that we're all up to the same speed. So, going back to the general idea of thrust, thrust is the mass flow rate times the exhaust velocity. And we really want to maximize both the mass flow rate and the exhaust velocity. But that's really, really hard to do because we need to accelerate stuff in an extremely short amount of time. And as I'm sure you're mostly aware of, if you've watched any movies or anything, action movies, explosions are a really, really good way of accelerating things quite rapidly. So it's really hard to actually beat explosions for optimizing mass flow rate and exhaust velocity. And that's basically where we combine like hydrogen and oxygen and we get just very large explosions. So a thermal engine uses some sort of a mechanism to heat up a gas and exhaust it. That's all it is. Heat up the gas and exhaust it. So the heated gas passes through the nozzle, and that changes the random motion to directed motion. And specifically, it changes thermal energy to kinetic energy. There are a lot of ideas for thermal engines. Some we've talked about already. There's the chemical thermal engine. So basically, we use chemistry to heat stuff up. It could be liquids or solids. Basically, we're having some sort of a chemical reaction, which is exothermic, which is heating stuff up. We use lasers, so we can shoot a laser into a combustion chamber and heat stuff up that way. Here are some examples of those. We've talked about a plasma thruster, but a plasma thruster is a fundamentally different concept and it is not thermal at all. It uses electric fields to accelerate particles. Very, very different process. So there are more types of thermal engines, some of which we're going to talk about, some of which we're not really going to talk about. But there's electric, there's solar, and there's nuclear. With an electric thermal engine, you basically pass a current through a medium to heat it up. We don't want to turn the gas into a plasma, we just want to get it really hot. A solar thermal is basically where we direct solar energy into the combustion chamber. So it's the same idea, similar idea to the lasers, but we do this with sunlight as opposed to lasers. And then a nuclear is different. So we use a power plant to heat up the gas to very high temperatures. So we've done this in the past. We have developed this thing called the Nuclear Engine for Rocket Vehicle Application, or NERVA engine. So the NERVA engine, which was developed in the 50s and 60s, had an exhaust velocity of about 7,950 meters per second, which is roughly 2 times the exhaust velocity of solid fuels, which is pretty good. NERVA uses a nuclear power plant to heat up the exhaust mass, which is hydrogen, instead of using chemistry. So it uses about a 1,000 megawatt power plant, nuclear power plant. And nuclear really could produce electricity at the same time as it's actually producing thrust for a trip to, say, Mars. And so it actually is a really good idea for long duration trips because you can produce thrust and you can produce electricity at the same time. Like I said, the fuel was hydrogen, and there are some disadvantages of hydrogen in that it must be stored at extremely cold temperatures to be a liquid, but it's a pretty good exhaust medium. The combustion chamber was made out of graphite, and the reason that it was made out of graphite is because it needed to handle extremely high temperatures that were upwards of 2,200 degrees Celsius. Here's a picture of the NERVA engine, and you could see that at its core, it had a reactor in it. And so it really was like a nuclear power plant, just like a regular nuclear power plant, except that it was used to heat up this helium, which was exhausted out the back. Here's another picture of the NERVA. And this is the first NERVA that was ever built. This is called the Kiwi, And the Kiwi was developed in 1959 and 1960, and it was named after this flightless bird because they were basically building this just to test it, not to actually fly it. The tests in 1962 caused the engine to actually be destroyed. But if you've ever watched any YouTube videos of anything of a rocket being destroyed, you know that it's a gigantic ball of flames. But in this case, basically the nuclear power plant failed, but there were no explosive components at all. And so nothing actually exploded, which is one of the beautiful elements of a nuclear power plant or a nuclear thrust engine, is that if it fails, it doesn't explode, which is great. The next test that was done was in 1964 through 1966. This is still a prototype. This was the Nerva NRX. I love this picture because it is very 60s type of picture. It sort of looks like this guy is actually proposing to the rocket engine, which is just amazing. Multiple tests were run with stopping and restarting the engine, which is really important. So if you're going to like go to Mars or someplace, you want to start the engines, you want to stop the engine, you want to start the engines, you want to stop the engines. So you need to do that in all of the tests, stops and restarts. The exhaust velocities that were produced were around 8,000 meters per second, which is really, really good. And the mass flow rates were about 30 kilograms per second. And that gave you a thrust of about 250,000 newtons. So the system was run with over 1,000 megawatts, with the combustion chamber reaching over 2,200 K. And it ran for about 15 minutes. So the Nerva XE was the next test, and that was done in 1968 and 1969. And those were very, very close to the flight design. So it was about 7 meters tall, about 2.5 meters in diameter, and it came in at a mass of about 18,000 kilograms. So it was pretty heavy. Nerva engines are really pretty powerful, but they're extremely heavy because you're basically carrying around a nuclear power plant. It produced about 250,000 newtons. It had an exhaust velocity at about 7,000 meters per second, and this is like a very, very close to flight unit version, and it produced about 35 kilograms per second of mass flow rate. The combustion chamber reached temperatures of about 2,200 Kelvin again. It produced about 1,100 megawatts of power. And this one ran for about 28 minutes. We could actually use this type of a system as sort of a tug to go from like low Earth orbit to the moon and back, or from Earth to Mars and back. This is a great technology for actually just pulling big things or pushing big things around the solar system or around Earth. And they had these visions back in the 60s and 70s, as these great illustrations show. But back in the late 60s, NASA's budget was about 5% of the total US budget. So it was really, really, really massive. And because of that, they had lots of money to do all these great developments of things like the Nerva engines. But as we started going to the moon and everything, the American public was basically saying, like, why are we spending all of this money on these space things when we're spending a lot of money on things like the Vietnam War also? And so NASA started getting its budget cut. And so the Vietnam War caused NASA's budget really to be slashed. It was very much devastated. The budget was cut in 70, 71, and 72, and then it was completely canceled in 73. And that was completely the end of the Nerva project. Even though this was a really cool technology that was almost ready to fly, completely cut. And, you know, when they cut gigantic budgets, lots and lots of jobs are cut. And so about 20,000 jobs were actually cut in the Nerva program. So throughout the time between then and now, people have been still talking about these nuclear thermal rocket concepts. So here's a great picture of one called the bimodal nuclear thermal rocket. Here's one that was proposed in 2023. This was a NASA DARPA program. And this one, I think that they've actually done some testing of the engine. And so it actually has like a high probability of really being tested and possibly being flown. But, the United States really has not embraced nuclear power very much since the 70s. Nuclear power has been sort of on the decline, and we haven't built any new nuclear power plants. But the talk of nuclear for green energy and stuff has really come back into fashion. And so it's possible that these nuclear power plant engines could actually come back also. So, in summary, thermal engines just heat up a gas, which flow through the nozzle to create thrust. Nuclear engines just use a nuclear power plant to actually do this. They provide power as well as thrust, so long duration missions are very well aligned with this because you can get energy from this to keep astronauts alive. Nerva was developed in the 60s, and it was about 18,000 kilograms, which is a very heavy rocket engine. But it had exhaust velocities of 7,000 to 8,000 meters per second, which is about twice as good as any rocket engine that we produce today, except for plasma thrusters. It uses hydrogen as an exhaust mass. It doesn't have enough thrust to actually get us off the ground, but it has enough thrust to get us to the moon once we're in orbit and to Mars once we're in orbit. And Nerva itself was canceled in 1973, but it could be making a comeback.